Okay, in the second example for 3.2, we're going to work with complex numbers, and you're going to see how we add and subtract complex numbers. Now, complex numbers just means that it's a number that has two parts, a real and an imaginary part. And the way we write that in standard form is a plus bi, where a is the real part and bi is the imaginary part. So I is your imaginary component, b is a coefficient that it may have. So a standard form for a complex number is just a complex number written with a real component and an imaginary component. So you can see here, each of these are complex numbers that we're either going to be adding or subtracting, and they each have a real and an imaginary component. Okay, so when you add and subtract imaginary numbers, you can look right here. In order to take the sum of complex numbers, okay, so if we're trying to add two complex numbers, all we do is add together the real parts and add together the imaginary coefficients and simplify. Okay, you're going to see an example of that in a second. For subtracting complex numbers, all we do is subtract the real parts and subtract the imaginary coefficients and combine, and that's our simplified standard form complex number. So this is going to make sense when you see these examples in a second. So let's look at the first one right here. We've got 8 minus I plus 5 plus 4i. So we're adding two complex numbers. So what we want to do is, the first thing we want to do is combine the real components. So 8 and 5. So we're going to write that. That's going to be our real part of our complex number. We also need to combine the coefficients of our imaginary part. So here, when it says minus I, that's the same thing as minus 1i. We've got 1i. The 1 is implied. It's not, we don't write down if we have 1x, we just write x. So here, our coefficient for the first complex number is negative 1, and then we have 4i. So our solution is going to be, we have 8 plus 5, which is equal to 13, and then plus the imaginary part, which is negative 1 plus 4, is positive 3. So we're going to have 13 plus 3i. And that's our answer. That's how simple it is to add complex numbers. You just add the real components and you add the coefficients of the imaginary together. Now, keeping track of the signs is important here. Okay, so we had a negative 1 here and a positive 4, which gives us a net of positive 3. Let's do a subtraction problem. So these become a little more, it's really important to keep track of your signs here so you know what you're adding and subtracting. So for B, we're going to have our real component, which is going to be 7 and then 3. So we're going to be taking 7 minus 3. And then for our imaginary component, we're going to have negative 6, and then we're going to be subtracting negative 6. So look what we get. So 7 minus 3 is the real component, plus, because we're combining it with our imaginary part, negative 6 minus negative 6. So we have negative 6 plus 6. So this ends up being 4, and then negative 6 plus 6 is 0. So we have 4 plus 0i. Now, we don't write out 0i, because 0 times anything, even 0 times I, is just 0. So this would actually simplify to 4. Okay, so if you have a problem like this example where either your real or imaginary part cancels out to 0, then you don't have to write that part in. So this just becomes 4. We don't write out the 0i. Let's look at our last one. Our last one, we have a complex number plus a real and an imaginary number. So again, here it's just a matter of keeping track of the signs. So we have 13 minus 2 plus 7i. We're subtracting this whole part from 13, and then we're adding 5i. So let's go and do this first. So what we want to do first is we want to subtract our 2 plus 7i from 13. So for this problem, we're going to, just like we subtract imaginary or complex numbers up here, we're going to combine the real parts, 13 minus 2, and then for 13 there is no imaginary component, so it's just going to be minus 7i. Okay, we have the minus gets distributed. So we have 13 minus 2 minus 7i, which is 11 minus 7i. All we did right here is we just did the 13 minus 2 and then minus gets distributed to 7i. Now we're adding 5i to that. So here 11 is just going to be our real component, and then we have minus 7i plus 5i, which is just minus 7 plus 5. We get 11 minus 2i. Okay, I know in all of these problems we're writing out every single step, which is important to do on these so that you can keep track of all the signs and make sure that you're adding and combining your terms properly. To get some practice in this, what I want you guys to do is just 8, 9, and 10 right now. Not all 6 of these, we're not multiplying yet. I want you to do 8, 9, and 10, just like we did in the examples. These 3 problems are exactly the same, so rewind it and rewatch a little if you need to. Go ahead and type in your answers in the box that pops up now.